What's up, YouTube? Andy from the Sports Card Flip Game here with the latest on how to get you plugged into all things sports cards. In today's video, we're going to be hacking some of my main thoughts on the grading companies. We're going to talk to you about how I go about evaluating cards for grading, what I'm looking for when I'm sending to different grading companies, and ultimately some of the ROI metrics that I'm using to hopefully get a good return and have some cool looking cards end up on my PC. If you haven't already yet, be sure to go ahead and click that sub button and join the team. And be sure to turn on the bell notification as well, just so you know I am posting content on the regularly, working hard to give you guys something new and different in the hobby, hopefully bringing some differentiated content. So be sure to leave me a comment down below as well, and let me know what you think about my strategies on the grading companies, on how to hack some ideas and hack some thinking on what you need to be grading as well. So without further ado, let's get into it. I've got really 4 main ideas and then some pro tips that I think you all need to keep in mind when evaluating what cards to grade, who to grade them with, how to go about actually evaluating them for grading, what are some tactics that you can use, and then ultimately, right, like thinking with the end in mind. So the first main idea that I want you to keep in mind when you're looking at cards to grade is to really start wide, right? Like have lots of cards in your collection that you would say, you know what, I'm gonna look at not 1, not 2, not 3 Derek Jeter rookie cards, right? I'm gonna look at those and find them and evaluate them for grading. I'm gonna go back and find that Manny Ramirez rookie card, but I'm gonna mix in Topps Chrome and some really ultra modern stuff, some Gypsy Queen, Luis Robert, right? Like I'm gonna have all the main players that are hyped, that are vintage, everything. And so kind of use that as a wide base. Ultimately, you go in and kind of my rule of thumb is cards that have maybe say a $10 to $20 value. That's sort of my threshold of like, okay, I'm gonna at least pull them out and evaluate them and at least start to think about grading them. And that's just, for me, again, these are all my thoughts, so feel free to disagree with me and let me know. You say, hey, this is stupid. There are some cards that I've graded that have a lower value than that $10 threshold, so it's not like I won't do it, but again, kind of use that as a rule of thumb. And notice these are all baseball cards, so I'll look at them and say, you know what, I'm only gonna evaluate baseball cards in this submission, whereas I might send basketball cards in another submission. So kind of looking at it that way, or you may go, you know what, I'm gonna do it by players and I'm only gonna send my Kyle Lewis cards, right? And knowing I'm gonna ride the hype train on him and get some of his cards graded. You might then in your sorting do away with saying, okay, I'm gonna send football cards, right? I'm not gonna send them in this. Or I'm going to look at cards and say, you know what, the value isn't high enough. They're the wrong sets. They're the wrong players. The condition of the cards may not be up to snuff. So ultimately, you're going to sift through some of those cards and say, you know what, I'm going to hold them out from being graded, and that's okay, right? Like totally fine for you to keep them in your PC. That's a good way to go about it. The second idea that I want you to keep in mind in hacking is knowing your grader, right? Knowing that there are different card companies that grade and they have specific things that they're looking for or kind of how the market views them. And the first one obviously is PSA. In the basketball game, this is really the main player, and especially when we're talking about ultra modern cards. So this Luka Doncic rookie, this is certainly a good example of a PSA 9 in that PSA case. Really great, good way to go about that. Really all across the board, you can't go wrong with PSA. They're certainly known as one of the industry leaders. When you start talking about BGS, right, like obviously they've got a little bit of variation. And one of the things that's important about them is they have a subgrade specific for autos. And SGC has that as well. We'll talk about them in just a second. But I think that's important to know that they've kind of carved out their niche, good, bad, or otherwise, as being a really high-end autograph, relic, you know, kind of those RPAs. A lot of times collectors may favor them and go to BGS because they also have their subgrades along with it. So this is something you need to know. The 9.5 is certainly the true representation of a gem mint card, but there's two different versions. So this is a min gem, meaning it's got 9 5s, but it also has some 9s. This is a true gem, meaning it has 9 5s for all 4 of the subgrades or higher. So there's a 10 in here as well, but you get the idea. The idea being that there are some variations or gradations even within a grading company. And then finally SGC, right? They're a newer player, especially when it comes to modern cards. Obviously, we know they've been around with pre-war cards, especially in the baseball market. So baseball, I think specifically when you're thinking about SGC, they're a really good alternative for baseball cards. They do have this 9.5. Again, that's a tweener grade that I think works out and plays really well to their advantage. And where I think SGC really kind of has a good market is when you're thinking also about basketball cards, but maybe not those really high-end basketball cards. So a great example of that are Chronicles, right? So I've got a lot of Chronicles here, some that I pulled on my channel in that Chronicles video. So I've got a Tyler Hero, I've got some Zion cards, I've got some Luka cards, I've got a little bit of everything. But the price point on these isn't that $80, $100, $200 range. These are typically $10 to $40 cards. So they kind of fit in that threshold of what I was talking about in my first tip. But you get the idea that maybe in that SGC holder, I think some of these cards, particularly these marquee cards, this is the Ja marquee, here's the Luka marquee, I think those are gonna look super cool in the SGC holder. And if you're paying that, I can wait for my card's price, I think that's a tremendous way to go for SGC. So next up is the third tip or hack that I want to give you, and it's to think in terms of your return on investment. Ultimately, you want to think about what the card's value is going to be in the actual slab, right? So this is right now about $300, but this card, if you were to look at it raw, maybe 100, 150, somewhere in that, and then the 9 versus the 10 obviously has a different multiplier to go along with it. So that's a factor you need to keep in mind, even though you don't ultimately know what grade it's going to get or what value it's ultimately going to command. But some of the things, variables that you can control are what's the actual cost that it takes to grade, right? So obviously different grading companies have different costs associated with them. PSA obviously has different levels of service that they provide. Same thing with BGS, same thing with SGC. So that is another factor that you need to keep in mind, along with the timing that it takes for that turnaround for those cards to come back. And you also need to think about the holding cost versus just keeping that in a raw format. So here are a couple of examples that I'll give you of some cards that I've sort of looked at and said, okay, let's filter it down. I know I need to get my Luka cards encapsulated. You guys know I can't go a whole video without giving you some Luka card examples. But in terms of thinking ROI and thinking about knowing my grader and starting with that very wide lens. I know that there are some Luka cards that I've actually gone in and excluded from considerations, said I'm not gonna put those in scope right now. So I know in specific that I wanna get my autograph cards, my Luka autos graded. I've looked at the condition of these. I've looked at ultimately where I think these are gonna do well. I think both of these are gonna go to BGS to be graded because I think that that will be the best representation and ultimate ROI for those cards. So those are gonna go to BGS. Some of the ones that I've looked at for PSA are a select, this is a purple Prism draft pick, what's that called? Relic card, numbered to 99. And oh, hey, I've got another select. I think both of those together will really look great in PSA holders, right? So that's my thought there. And then maybe something like this that's a fast break international mana mastery. Maybe that's SGC, maybe it's PSA. It may just depend on ultimately what I'm gonna submit. And that kind of goes into that fourth part that we want to talk about, which is the fourth part to narrow your card downs and ultimately figure out what you're gonna select to send to what grading companies. And so for that, you got to really look at and evaluate the individual cards, and I mean get down to the nitty gritty with it. So one of the things that obviously you're going to look at are corners, edges, center, surface, the overall aesthetic of the card, because PSA does provide and puts a value on the overall aesthetic of the card. There are some tools that you can use. So obviously looking at a grading loop, right, like that really does help to be able to shine some light and ultimately be able to magnify the cards. I actually have, along with that, another lamp that provides another light source. I'll turn that on so you can see that. Wow, that's gonna really change the look of things. But if I need to get really, really, really granular and look at and evaluate those cards, I'm gonna use these tools to do that. Now, you guys know I'm not the best when it comes to centering and surface and things like that, or centering in specific, so I've got one of these centering tools. We'll actually show you what that looks like, you know, maybe a little better behind some white. You put this up against the card to be able to understand, right, like an idea of kind of how that looks centered on the card. But sometimes you can't really tell, right? So here's some hacks or some pro tips that I can give you along the way that I think will help when you're going about evaluating cards. So one of the things I like to do is take, say, Topps Chrome 35th anniversary cards, and I've got 5 of them here, pretty much from each one of the key rookies. So what I'll do is I'll take a couple of them and compare them up against one another, and I'll take and look at the left to right centering, and it's kind of hard to do in the top loader. You have to actually line up the card, and I'll look and I'll say, oh wow, hey, this Bo Bichette is off versus the Kyle Lewis. Okay, so then I'll take another card and I'll say, man, this Kyle Lewis versus this Nico Herner, right? These look really good. And I'll do that same thing top to bottom. And then I may say, you know what? This Bo looks like it doesn't look like it's going to be up to stuff. Then I'll look at those next 4 in kind of my next stage. So that's the first one that I think you can do. What's also great, especially about big rips like Topps Chrome, is you can also look at multiple examples of the same card. So here's Kyle Lewis rookie cards from Topps Chrome. I can actually compare that. And especially if you don't know what centering is on some of those cards, like this is a tough one to know. Well, you can use some visual cues like this box down at the bottom that has the logo. You can use that and say, okay, hey, I'm gonna compare that up against the Kyle Lewis card, and you have to line them up like for like, and maybe you can find out that, hey, these all don't match up. And especially when you've got 2 of the same card, you can use one of those to figure out, hey, these aren't the same. This one looks like it's off-centered compared to this one. Let's use this as the sample and then try that against these other cards to then figure out if maybe some of the centering cues match up. And that same goes, again, left to right, top to bottom. You can do that and, you know, kind of hack it a little bit. Again, one of the pro moves that I think you need to keep in mind with all of this when you're grading cards is to think encapsulation, think protection, don't necessarily think hard dollar return. So when I think of return on investment, I'm thinking about what I actually paid for this Luka Doncic autograph card, right? I'm thinking about that from how do I protect my investment, not necessarily how am I going to maximize returns, because this is going to be a PC card. This is not going to be one that I sell. Whereas some of those other cards I may look to sell, and then I am thinking about it much more from a dollar value return. So again, kind of thinking with that lens in mind and thinking either encapsulation, money, right? Like understanding where that kind of falls on the continuum is really important. One of the things that Elite Co 3 says that I think is really important is you pay for the card, not the number on the card, right? So just paying for a 10 because it's a PSA 10 doesn't really do you any good. And one of the things that I think is going to help evolve over time is, hey, we need to expect that the card grading companies are being ultra stringent right now. So to get a PSA 10
or to get a true gem from BGS or a black label or a pristine, right? Same thing on SGC. Those are going to be harder and harder to come by. So as we continue to evolve, maybe you've got to look for a PSA 8 and say, you know what, this is a card that I'm okay with. And when I look at this card, this is a Zion Fast Break photo variation. There is not much wrong with this card. There's a little itty bitty bit of extra paper right at the top here. On the back, there's an indentation. But when you look at this really closely and you look at it wherever the centering tool is, you can see that this is actually not quite centered. And so you can get a better understanding of, oh, hey, just because this is a PSA 8 doesn't mean that it doesn't hold value. I really enjoy this card. I want this card, so it's important to me. And that's also going to come into play with the other grading companies, right? Because sometimes BGS cards don't come with center or with subgrades, and they're just going to give you, hey, this is a Pete Alonso, this is a prospect card, this is a 9.5, that's the grade, and you're going to have to live with that. And as SGC continues to come up in the market, this 9.5 is going to hold a premium over a PSA 9. But who cares to a certain degree, right? This is an encapsulated card. This is a Trae Young rookie card. This has value. So understanding sort of how that plays in the market. And then here's the final pro tip that I'll give you. You need to remember that behind each one of these grades from these companies, when they're putting it into the encapsulation, when they're making the grades, this is a human behind that, right? So they're prone to error, they're prone to mistakes. So I've seen a lot of hacks from different folks, and I think they're good ones, on providing the tabs behind the card savers so that the penny sleeve can be pulled out and you're not actually going to necessarily damage the card. When you've got multiple versions of the same card, you're going to put what you think is the worst copy at the first, and then behind that, the better versions of the copy. So if this one gets a 9, you would know for sure that this is going to get a 9, and maybe that gets a 10. All sorts of psychological little hacks that I think do hold value, but who knows if they really make that big of a difference in the overall scheme of things. Again, what I would counsel you, or at least advise you to do, is again, think protection, think encapsulation, think how you're going to actually ensure that the money that you're putting into sports cards is going to be kept safe over time, as opposed to how am I going to make tons and tons and tons of return on this card? Because nothing's a sure thing. The grading companies are prone to error. This is an inexact science. And ultimately, when you're trying to hack the system, you're not going to be 100%, right? And so when you think about those gem rates that people tout, or the grading companies that will say, oh, you know, this has to be this certain specification, at the end of the day, it's still going to be a piece of cardboard in a plastic case, right? And that's the end of it. So you have to get fun from these cards. You have to derive enjoyment one way or another. These are some hacks, some things that I think will help you along the way, but keep that mindset that I think is ultimately going to serve you well as you progress in the hobby. So that's going to do it for today's video. Again, leave me a comment down below. Let me know what you think about these hacks. Do you like them? Do you not? And until next time, keep your flip game strong.